Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. While we wait for the panel discussion to commence, we would like to take this opportunity to take a walk down memory lane to June this year when we launched the Asia panel.
Infrastructure is foundational to social and economic development. With COVID-19, there is an increasing need for sustainable and resilient infrastructure to support public health and economic recovery. Singapore is a key infrastructure hub in Asia. It's also ASEAN's largest green finance market and home to a rich ecosystem of infrastructure players and professional service providers. With this strong ecosystem, Singapore hopes to accelerate the development of sustainable infrastructure in Asia through the sharing of latest trends, ideas, and best practices.
There have been very significant global challenges affecting the future of infrastructure, and we need to respond to these challenges by designing, constructing, operating, and maintaining new and existing infrastructure to serve the needs of society and improve quality of life for all of our citizens.
Today's sustainability challenge is about net zero challenge, which means we are going to rely on wind, solar, hydrogen, and also natural-based carbon. So that's the foundation, which means you are going to have a much better forecasting on the global weather pattern, advanced IoT and AI and big data technology to harness such a complicated system, which help us to achieve a sustainable world.
Infrastructure will be a greater focus on technology adoption, such as AI and robotics, the use of drones to improve safety and inspections, digital twins, building information modeling and 3D printing. And of course, there will be a growing need for very secure, resilient, cloud-based technologies and connective infrastructure.
We should certainly embrace technology. And for example, cloud data environment platform development computing will enable us to roll out more effective offerings to developers and infrastructure investors without them having to build out at enormous expense and cost to the environment in terms of, for example, the use of energy.
I had a hand in developing membrane technology. And the beauty of membrane technology is that it can produce water efficiently and reliably. Evolution of technology will probably drive us toward more localized ways of living, better digital infrastructure, different kind of transportation with no pollution, more resources produced locally. That will be a good thing for the environment, also good for living in cities.
Sustainability used to be a nice to have. Now, sustainability is absolutely required. Infrastructure investment typically creates jobs. So infrastructure development itself not only creating the additional infra such as power to home and so forth, but improve the economical situation of communities and also the country.
There are large regions of the world that are challenged with economic growth. When you evaluate opportunities for growth and driving economic growth going forward, infrastructure is an important component to the integration of the global community. And so a well-integrated world based upon common standards with infrastructure would enhance the quality for all of our lives. This is not a matter of global competition. This is a matter of global partnership to make this a better world for all.
A future with sustainable infrastructure is one which provides for the long-term economic, financial, social, environmental well-being across generations. It creates a conducive environment for all to live, work and play, and it helps societies stay resilient to challenges or disruptions that may come their way. I look forward to the inaugural panel meeting, Asia Panel, towards a sustainable future.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our guest of honor, Minister in the Prime Minister's Office, Second Minister for Finance and National Development, Minister Indranee Rajah, Singapore. Guest of Honour, Minister Indranee Rajah, Minister in the Prime Minister's Office, Second Minister for Finance and National Development, Excellencies and representatives of the ASEAN member states, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and a very warm welcome to the third ASEAN Infrastructure Discussion Series and the Asia Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory Panel, or Asia Panel, Future of Infrastructure Discussion. This panel discussion is co-organized by the ASEAN Lead Implementing Body for Sustainable Infrastructure, LIPSI, ASEAN Secretariat, and Infrastructure Asia, Singapore's representative on LIPSI. The title of today's discussion is Future of Infrastructure, Shaping Asia's Sustainability Focus. This is the first of 3 panel discussions as part of the inaugural meeting of the Asia panel. The next 2 discussions will focus on the technology in infrastructure and sustainable investment financing. To start this morning's program, it is my pleasure to invite Minister Indranee Rajah to deliver the opening address. Minister Indranee, please.
Dato' Lim Jock Hoi, Secretary General of ASEAN, ASEAN Secretariat, Yang Mulia Awang, Haji Amir Hishamuddin Zakaria, Permanent Secretary, Brunei Darussalam and LIB SI Chair, Hem Vandi, Secretary of State, Ministry of Economy and Finance, Kingdom of Cambodia, Asia panel members, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Asia Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory, or Asia panel discussion. With climate change, we are experiencing more frequent and extreme weather events from increasing temperature and sea levels. This in turn will have an impact on both food and water security. The consequences of climate change are being keenly felt in Asia. Where stronger tropical storms along low-lying coastlines will flood some areas and even cause other areas to disappear. To mitigate this, the future of infrastructure needs to be sustainable and resilient. Many governments are already taking steps to build a more sustainable infrastructure. In Singapore, we have initiated the Singapore Green Plan 2030, which encompasses a whole-of-nation sustainable development agenda with firm action plans. The plan will also continue to build Singapore as a regional hub for green finance and sustainable infrastructure, while strengthening our commitments under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Significant financing is needed to support these sustainability efforts, with public capital alone not being sufficient. The Monetary Authority of Singapore's Green Finance Action Plan strives to develop the ecosystem and capabilities to enable green finance to scale effectively. This includes ensuring the consistency and comparability of green and transition taxonomies, promoting innovative solutions and deepening markets, encouraging consistent reporting and disclosure standards, harnessing technology to enable trusted, sustainable finance flows, and lastly, building knowledge and capabilities in sustainable finance. Despite significant efforts by governments around the world to catalyze sustainable financing and investing, COVID-19 has inevitably strained already limited fiscal resources. To ensure that the development of sustainable infrastructure continues to advance in tandem with population and economic growth, we need to prioritize projects and embrace technology to support growth areas that align with the trinity of national interests, regional needs, and global trends. This requires a multidimensional approach and strong public-private partnerships between governments, private sector players, and international financial institutions. Private investments provide an alternative source of capital for sustainable infrastructure projects, alleviating these fiscal constraints. Environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, assets have already become mainstream, and global investors are poised to double their ESG assets over the next 5 years from US $35.3 trillion in 2020. We are also seeing more private platforms, such as the one launched by Temasek and HSBC recently. This platform will invest up to $150 million in sustainable infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia, including in renewable energy, production and storage, water and waste treatment, and sustainable transport. Building sustainable infrastructure has also been made easier in current times, with private sector capital combining with catalytic solutions from multilateral development banks, or the MDBs, that can better meet the region's needs. MDBs and the International Monetary Fund have taken the lead in supporting countries' efforts to achieve the SDGs through providing finance, technical assistance, and knowledge to help their members tackle pressing developmental needs. Private sector participation can provide innovative solutions to infuse sustainable practices into logistics and supply chains, digital infrastructure, urban development or redevelopment, including for urban transport, and climate mitigation and adaptation. Like Podcast, a Singapore startup supported by SG Innovate, introduced machine learning and predictive artificial intelligence to track, predict, and quantify cargo delays, as well as forecast demand for containers. This reduces redundant resources spent on buffers, such as idle trucks and empty warehouses, thereby lowering supply chain costs. The solutions also enable greater supply chain efficiency and resilience by maximizing the cargo load of each shipment, which can in turn reduce the carbon footprint of trade activities. Singapore is also embarking on initiatives to channel more private investments towards sustainable infrastructure development in Asia. For example, Enterprise Singapore has launched the Enterprise Financing Scheme Green, or EFS Green, to provide risk share of 70% to catalyze lending for project developers, system integrators, and technology and solution enablers in green sectors. This results in better access to green financing for Singapore enterprises, which develop enabling technologies and solutions to reduce waste, resource use, and greenhouse gas emissions in line with the global agenda on sustainability. With more data, financing sources, and better use of the right technology, it's now possible to better plan, design, construct, operate, and maintain all types of infrastructure so that they are more sustainable economically, more sustainable against future disruptions, and more sustainable against the existential risk of climate change. This is the sustainable infrastructure that is needed by Asian countries in the coming years. To facilitate the exchange of insights across the sustainable infrastructure value chain and to bring perspectives from the different players in the value chain, we have established the Asia Panel. We are honored to have internationally renowned thought leaders, practitioners, as well as strong advocates of sustainable infrastructure with us on this panel. The panel will serve as a platform to exchange views on key global trends and best practices on sustainable infrastructure, and promote opportunities for the private sector to support Asia's sustainable infrastructure development. It's my pleasure to open the panel's inaugural forum today. Over the next 2 days, the panel members, together with our regional counterparts and private sector partners, will discuss key challenges in advancing sustainable infrastructure development in 3 public discussions. These discussions will shed light on how we can better sharpen our sustainability focus and establish concrete steps towards a more sustainable Asia. Private companies, as well as MDBs and regional governments, can complement each other with great synergy to accelerate sustainable infrastructure development in Asia. The Asia panel will work with these stakeholders to offer solutions to scale infrastructure development in Asia. I encourage all participants to make full use of this platform to forge new connections and contribute ideas on how we can work together to build a better future for the region. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Minister Indranee. I would now like to invite His Excellency, Engineer Awang Haji Amir Hishamuddin Zakaria, LIPSI Chair and Permanent Secretary for Infrastructure, Housing and Professionals for the Ministry of Development, Brunei Darussalam, to give his welcome remarks. Your Excellency, please.
Excellency Indranee Rajah, Minister, the Prime Minister's Office, Second Minister of Finance and National Development of Singapore, Your Excellency Dr. Lim Jock Hoi, Secretary General of ASEAN, Mr. Seth Tan, Executive Director of Infrastructure Asia, Singapore, Director Lim from the Connectivity Division, ASEAN Secretariat, colleagues, distinguished speakers, moderators, coast delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a good morning to everybody. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here to welcome all of you at this important event today. On behalf of ASEAN members of the lead implementing body on sustainable infrastructure, or LIPSI, I would like to express our sincere appreciation and congratulations to the Infrastructure Asia for organizing this third ASEAN Infrastructure Discussion Series and the Asia Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory Panel inaugural meeting, which also forms part of the LIPSI program, as the sharing of information, knowledge, and the opportunity to network is an important part to achieve our goal of ASEAN seamless connectivity. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, LIPSI works to further the cause of sustainable infrastructure in Asia and ASEAN, as set out in the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity, or MPAC 2025. LIPSI has three main initiatives. Initiative 1 is to help ASEAN member states with their connectivity infrastructure development by establishing and publishing a rolling pipeline of infrastructure projects, which can help to attract finance and investment. And with the help from the World Bank, the initial rolling priority pipeline was published in November 2019. The initial pipeline has prioritized 19 infrastructure projects covering transportation, power and ICT sectors. And there is, for example, there is a development of the Kijing Port in Indonesia, the Yangon-Mandalay Expressway in Myanmar, the ASEAN Digital Hub in Thailand, just to name a few. With the COVID pandemic changing the way we live and work, disrupting businesses and logistics, perhaps even permanently, ASEAN through LIPSI commenced a study called Project on the Assessment of Future Sustainable Infrastructure Trends and Priorities in a Post-Pandemic ASEAN. The report is due at the end of this year. Initiative 2 is to establish an ASEAN platform to measure and improve infrastructure productivity. The framework aims to help ASEAN member states to improve infrastructure productivity across all stages of the infrastructure project life cycle. The framework covers 7 work streams, which is including infrastructure planning, knowledge sharing, public investment management, streamlined project implementation, post-investment management, streamlined project implementation, post-implementation reviews, and enhancing productivity of existing assets. The framework was completed and published in October last year, and this year, LIPSI has carried out socialization exercises among the ASEAN member states to introduce and encourage the use of the framework. Initiative 3 is to develop sustainable urbanization strategies in ASEAN cities. LIPSI published the ASEAN Sustainable Urbanization Strategy, or ASUS, in 2018. which covers 7 sub-priority areas, which are inclusive and equitable growth, housing and home, personal safety and security, water, waste and sanitation, mobility, urban resilience, and education. This year, LIPSI engaged UN Habitat to do further work and undertake a project on accelerating the implementation of ASES, which commenced in January 2020. This project will look at 8 cities within ASEAN to help them to implement the ASEAN Sustainable Urbanization Strategy, and develop action plans and high-quality project proposals using the framework. Last month, LIPSI organized the first ever ASEAN Sustainable Urbanization Forum, held over 3 days with over 60 speakers and more than 900 participants over ASEAN. And end of this year, LIPSI will also be producing a report on the state of urbanization in ASEAN, which is due to be completed by the end of this year. And some of these initiatives will be shared during the coming discussions. Finally, on behalf of LIPSI, I would like to again thank the organizers, Infrastructure Asia, Infrastructure Asia, and the Singapore government, and the ASEAN Secretariat for all their hard work to make this third ASEAN Infrastructure Discussion Series and Asia Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory Panel meeting a success. Thank you. Wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I would now like to invite His Excellency Datuk Lim Jock Hoi, ASEAN Secretary General, to give his welcome remarks. Your Excellency, please.
Excellency Indranee Rajah, Minister, the Prime Minister's Office, and Second Minister of Finance and National Development of Singapore. Yang Mulia Awang Jamil Hishamuddin Zakaria, Chair of the ASEAN-led Implementing Body of Sustainable Infrastructure, LIPSI, and Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Development of Brunei Darussalam. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, selamat pagi. I'm very pleased to join you at the ASEAN Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory or Asia Panel inaugural meeting, as well as the third forum of the ASEAN Infrastructure Discussion Series on the future of infrastructure, co-organized by Infrastructure Asia, LIPSI, and the ASEAN Secretariat. I commend Minister Indranee Rajah and the government of Singapore for launching the Asia Panel and hosting today's event, which is a milestone for the regions as we chart our future sustainable infrastructure path to support the post-pandemic recovery and climate change impacts. Despite the unprecedented impacts of the COVID-19 and climate change, the region has demonstrated remarkable strength and resilience. ASEAN's economy is forecasted to rebound with a growth of 3.4% this year and 5.2% next year. I see windows of opportunity for ASEAN to build a future that delivers smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. Enhancing connectivity and pursuing sustainable infrastructure is crucial to provide the necessary foundation to realize this growth strategy. Hence, ASEAN has embarked on an assessment of future sustainable infrastructure trends and priorities in the post-pandemic ASEAN as well as climate change environment. This assessment will provide recommendations to enhance ASEAN infrastructure pipeline and identify new priority areas to respond to the pandemic as well as climate change. While the full impact of the pandemic are yet to be fully understood, it is certain that we need to address today's challenges to infrastructure, from financing and digitalization to climate change and rapid urbanization. This would require changing all assumptions and developing a new frame of thinking as the way we design and manage infrastructures today will be a key role on how we did well affect our society and the environment tomorrow. We need to approach infrastructure projects through the lens of connectivity, sustainability, resilience, and long-term community benefits. That will only be possible if we invest in new skills and capabilities for the sector, such as greater creativity and innovation, better communication and collaboration, stronger context mechanism, and a more multidisciplinary specialist. We should also forge partnerships to collectively address key challenges in infrastructure investment and engage more effectively the whole infrastructure ecosystem, including the private sector and the community as a whole. I believe today's sharing session will help us to learn more from each other, exchange latest best practices, and promote a more collaboration and on sustainable infrastructure. I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We will now proceed to the context setting segment. This session will be moderated by Mr. Seth Tan, Executive Director at Infrastructure Asia. He will be joined by our lead discussants for this session, Professor Chong Koon Hian and Lord Robert Mair. Professor Chong and Lord Mair are two distinguished members of the Asia panel. The panel was launched by Infrastructure Asia at the Asia Infrastructure Forum in June 2021. The panel comprises of international experts on sustainable infrastructure who will share their perspectives on topics across the entire infrastructure value chain. Professor Chong is the chair of the Center for Livable Cities and also chair for the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. Lord Mair is head of the Center for Smart Infrastructure and Construction and Emeritus Professor of Civil Engineering at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. Before the start of this segment, I would like to invite Mr. Tan to give his introductory remarks for this discussion. Mr. Tan, please.
Guest of Honor, Ms. Indranee Rajah, Minister in the Prime Minister's Office, Second Minister of Finance and National Development, Republic of Singapore, His Excellency Dato Lim Chok Hoi, Secretary General of ASEAN, His Excellency Awang Haji Amar Hishamuddin Zakaria, Permanent Secretary, Brunei Darussalam and DIPSI Chair, ASEAN DIPSI representatives, His Excellency Hem Fendi, Secretary of State, Ministry of Economy and Finance, Kingdom of Cambodia, Asia panel members, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and a warm welcome to the third ASEAN Infrastructure Discussion Series and Asia panel discussion on the future of infrastructure. The past two iterations of the ASEAN Infrastructure Discussion Series have focused on projects and themes pertinent to the ASEAN member states. This third iteration follows a similar vein, where we will be discussing the future trends and priorities of sustainable infrastructure in a post-pandemic ASEAN. As Singapore's DIPSI representative, Infrastructure Asia's aim is to support Asia's infrastructure development. This is done by harnessing Singapore's best-in-class infrastructure ecosystem in collaboration with global and multilateral partners and regional government agencies to catalyze infrastructure across the region. To that end, I'm heartened to have with us today Professor Chong Koon Hian and Lord Robert Mair, two distinguished members of the Asia panel. They will be setting the stage, the context of the discussion, and sharing their perspectives on the future of infrastructure. This will be followed by a presentation by the ASEAN Secretariat, who will share their initial survey findings on the future trends and priorities of sustainable infrastructure in ASEAN. And we also have gathered today industry leaders and experts covering different parts of the infrastructure value chain, to share with us their experience and lessons learned in implementing solutions for sustainable infrastructure. Let us jump straight into the session. I would like to first invite Professor Chong to set the context of the discussion and share her perspectives. Professor Chong, please.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you very much. And to all participants in Singapore, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants from elsewhere who are tuning in. Very nice to see all of you here. We are going to talk a lot about infrastructure today, and we know that infrastructure plays a really key role in supporting Asia's very ambitious goals for a more livable environment that is sustainable, resilient, and climate ready. So to set the context, my comments are going to be rather broad as a backdrop, even as we think about infrastructure. So if I may, I'd like to suggest 4 key principles that we could think about even as we think about developing infrastructure for our cities and our different countries and regions. So the question really is, how can new urban infrastructure support sustainable development goals? Next slide, please. I think, firstly, it's important to synchronize infrastructure with long-term urban planning. A very well-conceived plan in any city will help us to grow in a very orderly manner. So it's important that we do very long-term planning. And I'm going to cite the example of Singapore, mainly because I'm very familiar with Singapore, where long-term planning is very important for us as a land and resource constrained city-state. Every piece of land is precious. It has to be very well coordinated. So next slide, please. So in terms of planning, it helps us to factor in livability, sustainability, and resilient goals right from the start, to get it right from the start. And because we plan long-term, we will be able to identify the growth and rejuvenation areas early. Next slide, please. And this means that we can project and anticipate infrastructure needs to understand the very difficult trade-offs and prioritize our infrastructure investments, because money is never enough. So where do we put that investment first? And having more coordinated infrastructure planning with development needs will minimize ad hoc and very siloed infrastructure decisions and investment mistakes. Next slide, please. And I would just cite an example that I think we're all familiar with. Next slide, please. And that is on transportation planning. So for example, in the case of Singapore, the mass rapid transit with almost $100 billion Singapore dollars investment is meant to support our transit-oriented strategy, which is to support very decentralized polycenters and high-density nodes. It serves all these areas. At the same time, while it serves these areas, it also makes sure that the MRT network is viable because it will have sufficient commuter mode. So this synchronization of infrastructure with land use planning is absolutely essential. Next slide, please. The second principle I would advocate is to think about a circular model. Basically, because of resources, it's important for us to try to minimize and optimize resources. So obviously, in the case of Singapore, circularity is important because it means that we try to organize production, supply, and consumption of materials into what we call a closed loop, because this will reduce the pressure on finite materials and natural resources depletion. So Singapore's very important example is the water loop. We have closed the water loop because we have recycled all used water that we use to try to continue with this virtuous cycle of having water, enough water. But beyond that, we are also highly resource constrained. So becoming a zero waste nation in this idea of circularity is very important. So we are also making a strong push towards circularity in waste materials. Next slide, please. So beyond water, we want a very integrated system approach. And so Tuas Nexus is a good example where we have integrated waste management facility with water reclamation plants. Everything that you incinerate generates heat, heat generates electricity, which runs the reclamation plant, and the sludge from the reclamation plant is then fed back for incineration, again generating heat and therefore electricity. So that's a virtual loop that we've tried to close in terms of the water waste energy loop. Next slide, please. The third principle I think we can think about is about adopting a very multifunctional approach. So this is an example, those in Singapore you'll be familiar with, is the Marina Barrage. It's meant for flood control. It's meant to keep waters at a certain level so that it makes the city beautiful and aesthetic with a very constant water level. And next slide, please. It also is a recreation facility where people fly kites and make use of this very beautiful strategic location for picnics. And this is actually a pump house. Next slide, please. Another example is the latest desalination plant located right in the East Coast Park. It is a desalination plant, but it is placed underground so that on the top you have a beautiful green space, again fully integrated with the park for leisure use. So it has a social element to infrastructure. Next slide, please. Another example is Punggol. Next slide. What we did was we dammed up 2 rivers to create freshwater reservoirs, and we connected these 2 reservoirs with, instead of a pipe, with a man-made river. And we added a lot of greenery into Punggol New Town, which is a public housing town. Next slide, please. And as a result, you don't only have a functional link, like a pipe in the form of a waterway. The waterway becomes a leisure facility and actually also increases real estate values all around. Next slide, please. Another example. Singapore is a city-state surrounded by water. Climate change means sea level rises become an existential threat for us. The intention is that in the long term, we want to reclaim more land in the East Coast for many reasons, because we need the land. Next slide. Secondly, we can reclaim it in such a way that the reclamation becomes coastal protection for the very low-lying areas in the East Coast. And if we can design the reclamation in an innovative, creative way, we create a water body to store water as a freshwater reservoir and also for recreation. So it's really, infrastructure can be multifunctional use. Next slide. And of course, lastly, it's about building intelligent infrastructure. Next slide, please. It's no longer enough to build in a sustainable way. We have to build in a resilient way and to be climate ready as well. Next slide, please. And we can leverage digital intelligence for better city management and in managing all our municipal services to make sure they are safe and reliable, and we can optimize our resources and be efficient. I'm sure this will be discussed further for the rest of our conversations, so I will just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chong. Next, may I invite Lord Mayor for your context setting, please.
Well, could I start by saying what a great pleasure it is to be taking part in this special event dealing with sustainable infrastructure in Asia. I'm going to speak really from my experience as an engineer, as a civil engineer, and I'm going to talk about the importance of smart infrastructure and construction. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the benefits of smart infrastructure and what can we do with better data, and speak about data-centric engineering for resilient and sustainable infrastructure. And I will end up saying some words about the importance of digital infrastructure and the role of digital twins. Next slide, please. So I think what we are really aiming to do in a major way now is to incorporate sustainability enabling techniques and technology into construction. So now there are major changes in the use of off-site manufacture That means really, instead of pouring a lot of concrete on site, taking a very long time, doing it in very difficult conditions, often in bad weather, we can more and more make components in factories and deliver them to the site and assemble them on the site. And this makes for much increased quality, it reduces waste. It's a growing trend, a very important growing trend. New materials. So we are looking to use much more low carbon concrete and other materials, again, all very relevant to sustainable infrastructure. And also sensors. I'll say more about this in the coming minutes, but the importance of using all of the new breakthroughs in sensors, in robotics, all of these can very much improve the way in which we construct infrastructure. So incorporating sensors and data analytics that goes with that to monitor the whole life of infrastructure assets is a hugely important and growing area. Next slide, please. So people often ask, well, what do we mean by smart infrastructure? And we have that really encapsulated by these two intersecting circles. We have the physical infrastructure, which we are all familiar with, whether it be transport or energy, water or telecoms or waste. But we also now more and more have the digital side, where we have sensors, we have the Internet of Things, we have all kinds of networks, we have big data, we have increasingly vast amounts of data, and we have machine learning. Now those two circles, when they intersect, is really where we have the smart infrastructure, where we are combining the physical and the digital. And smart infrastructure is really all about that infrastructure responding itself intelligently to changes in its environment. And that gives it the ability to influence and direct its own delivery, its own construction, in other words, its use, its maintenance, and its whole support. And the message here really is that smart infrastructure is the key to more sustainable infrastructure. Next slide, please. So what can we do with better data? We can do a huge amount with better data. And there are really four groups here, starting with design. If we have better data, we can use that to calibrate and validate our models. We can challenge the way we design infrastructure. Do we have to do it the way we've always done it? Maybe not, almost certainly not, if we have the data that can tell us how, in fact, the infrastructure is performing. We can challenge old-fashioned design methods, and we can easily achieve 20 or 30% economy in what we design. And we can design for the whole life value. And we can optimize different material uses in design. And importantly, we can have an accurate assessment of the role of carbon in design. All of that is supported by data. During construction, the materials management side can be much improved with better data. Construction progress, quality monitoring. We can reduce waste considerably. We can improve quality. We can improve delivery. And then when the infrastructure is complete, we have the operation and maintenance. Again, we can use data and sensors to tell us how to undertake condition monitoring, condition prediction. We can have risk-based maintenance rather than ad hoc maintenance. And we can get a much, much superior whole life, value-based asset management. And this, of course, all is relevant to smart city systems. So we can use data for demand forecasting, for optimizing networks, for using city-scale digital twins. I'll say more about that in a minute. And we can meet infrastructure needs with much better data. Next slide, please. So the message really is that we are in a world of considerable technological advances in terms of sensing, And if we combine advanced sensing with big data analytics, then we have a very powerful combination. The data-centric engineering can change the way we do infrastructure in a far, far more sustainable and efficient way. Next slide, please. So the role of the digital twin is crucial here. We have the physical twin, which is obviously the actual physical infrastructure itself. But before we do any construction, we should be constructing the digital twin of that infrastructure. And we can then combine the two things very powerfully. We get data about the infrastructure, which we feed back into the digital twin. We can use it during construction. And if we add sensors also to our infrastructure, it provides us with the data. So we can measure the performance of the infrastructure. That enables us to improve design. It enables us to have better whole life management, and it gives us much more sustainable infrastructure. So our vision is that no infrastructure should go forward without a digital twin being constructed before any construction even commences. Next slide, please. So in summary, I hope I've just been able to illustrate the considerable benefits of smart infrastructure and construction. We should incorporate sustainability-enabling technologies into construction, off-site manufacture, new materials, sensors, robotics. And there is a huge potential for better data and data analytics. And digital twins have a very important role for more sustainable infrastructure. The vital importance of data to maximize efficiency of the new and existing infrastructure. That is the real message I want to get across. The need to fully exploit the digital transformation that we now are seeing in the world around us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, for the context setting. I think these thoughts from Prof. Chong and also Lord Mayor give us a lot of food for thought in terms of how we set out ourselves for the future of infrastructure. Now I pass the mic back to the MC.
Thank you, Mr. Tan, Professor Chong, and Lord Mayor for setting this context. We will now proceed to a presentation by Mr. Lim Zi-jin, Director and Head for the ASEAN Connectivity Division. He will share the latest findings from a project commissioned by ASEAN LIPSI to assess the future trends and priorities of sustainable infrastructure in a post-pandemic ASEAN. Mr. Lim, please.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to all of you. My presentation this morning will be divided into three parts. First, I will provide the background and overview of the project. Second, I will share key highlights on initial findings of the project. Third, I will discuss the next steps for this project. Can you pull up the slide, please? So allow me to share with you that this project is part of ASEAN's efforts in implementing sustainable infrastructure under the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025. ASEAN connectivity is about enhancing networks and improving their functionality, efficiency, and resilience towards delivering tangible outcomes for ASEAN peoples. As set out in the Master Plan, as you can see in the screen, these can be achieved through 15 initiatives under 5 strategic areas of sustainable infrastructure, digital innovation, seamless logistics, regulatory excellence, and people mobility. Next slide, please. To drive sustainable infrastructure, we have 3 initiatives. I will not go into these details, but just to say that we have established the initial pipeline of ASEAN infrastructure projects. We have also developed the ASEAN Infrastructure Productivity Framework, and we have also developed the ASEAN Sustainable Urbanization Strategy. So now it is time for us to come together and implement these different initiatives that ASEAN has put together. Next slide, please. So let me now go to the project specifically. the COVID-19 crisis has changed the landscape that we work or we live in. As a result, ASEAN has embarked on this project with the technical support from Ernst & Young and funding from Australia to adapt to the changing regional context by identifying infrastructure productivity and infrastructure priorities to support socio-economic recovery and promote resilience in key sectors, and hence boost the region's ability to tackle future crises. So the project is expected to enhance understanding of the impact of COVID-19 on infrastructure and provide recommendations on new sustainable infrastructure priorities, as well as a prioritization framework to determine suitability of infrastructure projects for the initial pipeline. Next slide, please. So let me now go to the key highlights or initial findings of this particular project. Next slide, please. So in our consultations with various key stakeholders, we have covered a number of areas or topics which you have seen from the slides. There is a general view that sustainable infrastructure needs to respond to changing demographics, embracing low carbon economy, resilient and economically affordable, while remaining a driver for development and shared prosperity. The project has involved extensive consultation with stakeholders across different sectors that you can see in the screen, from transport, energy, finance, digital, and smart cities, as well as our partners through focus group discussions and regional workshop to ensure that our assessment is as robust as possible. I will touch on 5 key highlights on the initial findings of this project, covering macroeconomic impact, traction in digital infrastructure, logistics and supply chain, sustainability and resilience, and infrastructure finance, and capacity building. Next slide, please. First, in terms of macroeconomic impact, the pandemic has impacted ASEAN economies unevenly. As mentioned by the Secretary General earlier, the region is projected to recover in 2021 and 2022 with an average growth rate of 3.4% and 5% respectively. While the region remains vigilant against the current COVID pandemic and its devastating impacts, there are encouraging signs as countries are reopening their borders and there are more medical tools against COVID-19. As we move into the new normal, many governments are preparing and approaching infrastructure projects through the various lens of connectivity, sustainability, resilience, inclusiveness, and long-term community benefits. Next slide, please. Second, we have also seen that the pandemic has accelerated digital transformation across the public and private sectors. It is probable that this trend will continue after the pandemic. As you can see in the slide, ASEAN's digital economy is expected to grow at 5-year compounded annual growth rate of 24%, reaching $309 billion by 2025. Growth will be supported by positive demographics, rising affluence, and technology adoption. As policymakers continue to encourage digital adoption through national broadband plans and digital agendas, the access, quality, and affordability of connectivity will invariably command the associated infrastructure to provide a faster and more reliable connection. We have also seen that more transactions and infrastructure funds focusing on information and communication technology infrastructure and other enablers of digitalization, such as data center, subsea cables, and telecoms towers. Next slide, please. Third, with shocks growing more frequently and more severely, supply chain varies in the level of their exposure and vulnerability. Supply chain deficiencies exacerbated by the pandemic, resulting in shortages of critical material inputs and labor, impact the imports and exports of the region. It is recognized that the region needs to expand and improve logistics and supply chain networks for the post-pandemic recovery. For example, the ability to reroute components and flexible production dynamically across sites can keep production going in the wake of a shock. However, this will require robust digital systems as well as analytic capabilities to run scenarios based on different responses. So investment in these areas will be critical if we would like to address the issue of logistics and supply chain networks that are resilient and yet efficient. We have also received other feedbacks, which include how more companies are sourcing options closer to the region, while recognizing the need to incorporate transparency, resilience, and flexibility into their supply chain strategies. The stakeholders that we have talked to also shared the view that cold chain infrastructure has become an increasingly important area of focus. Next slide, please. Fourth, sustainability and resilience in developing and planning for infrastructure have become key areas of focus for many ASEAN member states. Rapid urbanization and the increasing role of cities in advancing economic growth, embedding resilience in urban infrastructure will be essential to prepare cities from future shocks. Climate events have accelerated the importance of sustainability. Various member states, our partners, have responded through various channels. Renewable energy and electrification are primary path to low carbon economy. It was also found that both public and private sector across ASEAN member states have been increasingly more active in mobilizing green, sustainable linked, and social bonds in the past few years, with the main use of proceeds in energy and building categories. There are also emerging views on the importance of decarbonization efforts, with the region needing to ensure a more equitable transition. And the availability of transition capital will be particularly key in this context as we build our future infrastructure projects to support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. On infrastructure finance and capacity building, our consultations have found that some ASEAN member states have limited capacity to tap on international infrastructure finance effectively. In addition, there are also immense need for technical assistance, capacity building, and knowledge sharing opportunities, particularly to support project preparation and implementation and attract project financing. Based on Ernst & Young analysis, ASEAN deal volume in 2020 outnumbered the 2019 value, largely due to uptick in renewable energy deals in ASEAN. However, in terms of value, it has declined. What I will say is, always may not be able to unlock new doors. I think there are vast opportunities for ASEAN to engage our partners, including multilateral development banks and the private sector, to forge more partnerships and work together to find and develop solutions to realize more sustainable infrastructure investment in the post-pandemic ASEAN. Next slide, please. Now I will touch on some closing thoughts. Next slide, please. So from our consultation, it was found that the initial pipeline of ASEAN infrastructure projects and the projects within remain relevant to ASEAN's objectives of improving access and increasing connectivity in and among ASEAN member states to support recovery and build resilience for the future. It can also complement existing regional and sub-regional initiatives through three ways, namely visibility, in a sense that how we can generate greater visibility of projects to our various partners. Capacity, how we can strengthen capacity building efforts to collectively plan, assess and structure infrastructure projects, financing and funding, how we can tap on best practices in the region and around the world in order for us to attract more infrastructure investment and strengthen synergies for co-financing and co-funding. Next slide, please. ASEAN held a regional workshop last month on this particular project, which the member states and key stakeholders attended. Some of the preliminary views shared include the need to adopt a broader definition of digital infrastructure. This means that broadening the definition to include various aspects of ICT, including IoT and so on. Minding that the current pipeline focuses very much on transport and energy projects. They also share the need to expand the eligibility of infrastructure sectors for the pipeline to cover other sectors such as logistics, supply chain, smart urban projects, and social infrastructure projects. There is also an emphasis to look at what are the relevant criteria that can support the achievement of sustainable development goals. And basically, the sense is when we want to develop infrastructure project, it is time to think differently and innovatively about alternative models for delivering sustainable infrastructure. So with that, we look forward to having further thoughts on future priorities on sustainable infrastructure in ASEAN and working with you in shaping sustainable infrastructure for the future. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lim. Excellencies, ASEAN representatives, discussants, and participants. We'll now take a short 5 minutes break and continue the session at 11:05 a.m. The second half of the session will consist of a roundtable discussion. Thank you, and we'll see you shortly. Excellencies, ASEAN representatives, discussants, and participants. Welcome back to the third ASEAN Infrastructure Discussion Series and the Asia Panel Future of Infrastructure Discussion. We will now proceed to the roundtable discussion. This session will be moderated by Mr. Tan. Mr. Tan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome back. For the next segment, we would like to have a brainstorming or a roundtable discussion. The objectives of the discussion is to discuss the initial findings from ASEAN survey on assessment of future sustainable infrastructure trends and priorities in a post-pandemic ASEAN, and share relevant solutions on sustainable infrastructure and infrastructure journeys taken by other regions or even in this region in meeting sustainable development goals. COVID-19 has shone a spotlight on the importance of digital and logistics connectivity. These conduits are critical backbones to the livability of people now in the present and actually into the future as well. Digital infrastructure such as fiber optics and data centers underpin the digital transformation of economies and societies, facilitating resilience, inclusion, and growth even amidst the lockdowns of COVID-19. Logistics infrastructure is critical in maintaining the integrity of supply chains, bringing essential resources like food, construction materials, and even vaccines to all over the globe. Building resilience in this sector requires innovative solutions such as digitalization and even cold chain storage capacities to be made widely available within the region. I'm very heartened to be rejoined by our esteemed Asia panel members, Professor Chong Kun Hian and also Lord Robert Mayer. And with us today, just to quickly let everyone know, we also have Mr. Tong Yu Heng from Netlink Trust. Thanks, Yu Heng, for joining us. Mr. Chris Street from Princeton Digital Group. Hi, Chris. Mr. Luca Tonello from Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. Hi, Luca. And Mr. Robert Yap from YCH Group. Hi, Robert. And joining us virtually is Ms. Isabel Chatterton from IFC. Hi, Isabel. And Mr. Arun Khan from Leonie Hill Capital. Hi, Arun. Without further ado, let us dive into this roundtable discussions. We have pre-prepared 3 questions, which I've pre-selected some of the discussants to share with us their thoughts. But if any of the other discussants have any comments or interventions, just raise your hands in person. Or for Isabel and Arun, you can just raise your hands virtually and then I'll come to you. This session will be roughly about 25 minutes. The first question is, in what ways can ASEAN meet its priorities for sustainable infrastructure based on the initial findings from ASEAN's LIPSI's assessment? For that, may I invite Professor Chong to give your comments and intervention.
Thank you, Seth, and hello again. Welcome back, everybody. Well, from the survey, it seems that the broad consensus across ASEAN is that digital infrastructure and cross-border infrastructure, such as logistics and supply chain, are the key infrastructure areas that in the post-pandemic era. And as I mentioned just now, digital intelligence can be harnessed for better city management because digital solutions can really speed things up and improve the responsiveness of a city and give it a level of agility to adapt and to adjust very quickly, as we have seen in the pandemic times. But then how can we do it in an effective way? Everybody is rushing to beef up digital infrastructure, but again, I'd like to put forward a couple of points for consideration to set the stage. I think firstly, we really need to be clear on our objectives for digitalization and the impact and benefits for pursuing certain projects. Why do I say this? Because I've been doing this for many years, looking at digitalization. We started many years ago by looking at smart applications individually, right? Everyone is very enamored by the smart application. But then it is important to think of it in a far more integrated way. And I say this because of our public housing towns in Singapore, where we introduce a very clear smart framework for exactly why we want to digitalize. And in our case, it was very clear. It was for the benefit of greater sustainability, greater efficiency, and greater reliability of services. So I think we need to be very clear why we're doing it and to do it in an integrated way, which comes to my second point. You really need to think of it at the systems level when we're developing a digitalization projects, so that we do not develop siloed projects that will cause inefficiencies. Because having clarity means that the way you collect the data, the way you standardize the data, and the development of the interoperable platforms become very, very important. So it's again that clarity is important. The third point I like to raise is that we need to put in place some critical enablers to make our vision a reality in whatever vision that we have in the various cities that we want to apply digitalization. Of course, we need to develop the physical and digital infrastructure to make smart, scalable in a cost-efficient way. Very few of us have the option of doing it as a greenfield site. We have all these millions of dollars of existing infrastructure. So how do we do it in a cost-effective and scalable way? The lamppost becomes a favorite, isn't it, amongst many of us, because we use the lamppost to mount sensors, and then we use it as a power source to power our sensors and smart devices. So it's about layering new infrastructure with existing infrastructure. And it's also important to have governance, policies and standards that are set, such as privacy laws, cybersecurity and data protection, and continue efforts to keep calibrating between governance of data policy and related activities like AI, which has become the flavor of the day right now, AI. And finally, I just want to talk about digital inclusiveness. It really has to be a priority to ensure that we do not end up with a digital divide and exacerbate the inequalities in society. So I think in Singapore, we are very mindful of this. We have a digital readiness blueprint that helps to expand and enhance digital access for inclusivity. We want to improve digital literacy and encourage digital participation. So we even have digital ambassadors that go out and teach the elderly how to use smart devices and smart applications. We send digital ambassadors out into the markets to help the hawkers and the people who are selling things in the market to go online to improve their businesses. So this digital inclusiveness is something we have to be very mindful of. So I'll just stop there. Thank you, Seth.
Thanks, Prof. Chong. What about you, Lord Robert? Any comments or observations?
Well, I follow on from Professor Chong's very good comments. Firstly, on digital transformation, I think that there is, undoubtedly a huge importance for widespread internet access, and there is an urgency to increase the speed, the quality, and the affordability in supporting digital infrastructure. And that it's probably not just going to rely on the private sector, that increasingly it'll vary from country to country, but governments may well need to support expanding the network to remote areas, to underdeveloped areas, to support a ubiquitous deployment of internet and internet services. And there are issues too about pricing for broadband and internet services. I think all of those are key issues. And Professor Chong talked about aging population, and I think there is a huge priority right across the world in terms of skills that we, as we are going through a complete digital revolution, we need to be sure that our younger generation are well equipped for that. And broadly speaking, that's happening. They make sure that they're well equipped. They almost teach themselves to be well equipped. But there is an issue with the aging population across the world, that there is a whole sector of our communities that are not readily able to access the internet. A couple of final points. Sustainability and resilience. And resilience is a word that's very often used, almost as often as sustainability. And it really is the ability to withstand shocks. Those shocks might be from natural hazards, they might be from flooding, earthquakes, landslides. But the importance is the ability to recover and to bounce back. And we need, in thinking about our infrastructure, particularly in the light of climate change, to be thinking more about proactive preparation rather than reactive response. And clearly ensuring resilience of infrastructure is going to be very important for new infrastructure, but it's probably more important for our existing infrastructure. We need to pay more attention to the resilience of our existing infrastructure. My final point really is on the priorities for infrastructure. And clearly we're going to be focusing more on projects involved with green energy, with water, with waste, the whole supply and powering of electric vehicles and hydrogen. These are the kind of new and important and increasingly vital parts of new infrastructure for sustainability. And the final point, really related to my earlier point I just made, we need to fix the old infrastructure before we rush into the new infrastructure. And there are plenty of opportunities for doing that with new technologies. We don't necessarily need to be rushing into new infrastructure when the old infrastructure might well still fulfill the function. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mayor. May I also invite Isabel? IFC has a worldwide remit, and I'll be interested in Isabel's intervention.
Thank you, Seth. I'm really delighted to be here today. So I actually fully agree with the incorporation of the ICT and telecoms infrastructure into the scope of the ASEAN study. Fully agree that we need to move away from physical infrastructure to considering infrastructure as a service. And that really aligns very well with the comments of the panelists. So 3 observations that I would like to point out for the conversation today. So first, when we look at telecoms infrastructure, and this is something that we are going through internally within IFC, we really need to change our mindset and move away from the 4 traditional verticals that we have been used to working with. So mobile operators, broadband, towers, etc. We really need to look at the new verticals that have been enabled and created by artificial intelligence and the access of data. So I would recommend to really look at 3 buckets of new infrastructure within telecoms. So one is the space of cloud and data infrastructure as a service. Second is the issue of IoT and small cells. And third is the space of rural connectivity and ESCOs. So I would really recommend us to touch upon those 3 new verticals today if we can. I think in the terms of logistics, I fully agree with the incorporation as part of the transport vertical within the work of the ASEAN Connectivity Division. I guess I wanted to mention the aspect of green connectivity. We certainly see that reducing the carbon footprint and catering for the transport of goods in this new, more sustainable world is going to be critical for us to focus on. That, of course, includes e-mobility, making sure that we're greening the passenger transport, and that we look at the greening and sustainability of our third-party logistics change, also temperature control logistics, particularly in the region. We're looking at that possibility in countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, etc. And that should not exclude potentially the greening of trucking and trucking activities. So that's the first point, to really go into the granularity of what the artificial intelligence or data is giving us in infrastructure. The second is the aspect of sustainability and resilience, which has been mentioned in the introduction. we want to just acknowledge that this is not a fad that is going to move away anytime soon. ESG factors are really increasingly at the front of mind of all the investors. Certainly in our day-to-day activities, that is very much a concern for everyone we speak with. And the steady growth in sustainable finance debt that we've seen in the issuances between 2013 and 2020 it really corroborates the fact that this is here to stay. We have seen a growth for something like 26 billion in 2013 to about 732 billion last year. So there's a profound shift in this area, and many of the investors have already recognized that companies with strong sustainability targets, with strong ESG practices, are outperforming the companies during the COVID-19 pandemic and most likely subsequently to the pandemic. And the third point is this aspect of infrastructure as a service. I do think that we need to move away from building hardcore infrastructure. We need to look at it from the service lens at all points in time. I think to give you an example, if we look at mobility as a service, and in this space of connectivity, there's been plenty of research that suggests that the revenue of mobility as a service are going to well exceed 52 billion by 2027. I think as of now, the data suggests that we had about 400 million of investment in 2020. So this service angle should provide users with the possibility to move easily and cost effectively. It should also attract new users to, for example, public transport and shared transport, which doesn't exist in some societies as a habit. And third, it could also enable us to provide new mobility services in response to the evolving demand by utilizing captured data. I remember there was a German Transport Association study that said that they had implemented a new software that predicts passenger numbers and suggests alternative connections that have lower estimates in terms of passenger count, etc. So I think that's something that I do think is critical that we think of. And the last point to mention is, I guess, the fact that we do have a responsibility when we manage data to look at the regulatory aspect of data privacy and data protection. We're trying to work with many of our companies in the space of data, our clients, but this is not an easy topic to discuss. And I just wanted to make sure, Seth, that we can have a conversation today about that. It will be critically important. I want to mention an example. In Salvador, we are working with a power plant client to support the surrounding port town community with an app that is at the moment connecting micro and small businesses and buyers virtually. And so this client of ours is using technology to basically help avoid a reduction in sales because, of course, of the quarantine and the people trying to avoid reduced contact, so that the community can keep the source of income. And at the same time, this particular app is going to facilitate access for goods and services in the area residents, and is going to rely primarily on data. So we do need to acknowledge that the use of data and the traffic of data and personal data is here to stay, and it's going to be increasingly important in the design, the operations, and the maintenance of infrastructure assets. And therefore, we do need to have a conversation on how to make sure that privacy and protection of data is there in the design and in the planning stages of infrastructure. Let me stop there, Seth, and really, again, delighted to be here with all of you today.
Thanks, Isabel. In the interest of time, let's move on to the second question and maybe have a more free-flow interventions towards the end. The second question is, many digital infrastructure investments have in recent past been private sector-led, but more such infrastructure is needed. What lessons can be drawn globally that can potentially, or even regionally, that can potentially help ASEAN governments catalyze more such sustainable digital infrastructure? Who better to ask than Yu Heng? Yu Heng, would you like to give us a few comments?
Thank you, Seth. Digital infrastructure, like physical infrastructure, are required or are critical for a well-functioning economy. Digital infrastructure would encompasses broadband connectivity, data processing, data storage, as well as data sensing technologies. Of these, broadband connectivity would be the key enabler. On which other technologies layers could be added? Over the last 10 years, many countries have been investing in broadband connectivity. I will talk a bit more about fiber broadband. A lot of countries are making investment into the area of fiber broadband, specifically fiber to the home. We can look at the examples of Singapore, Spain, the UK, as well as New Zealand. Today, where are we in terms of fiber broadband penetration in these countries? Singapore is close to 100%. New Zealand is above 80%. Spain is about 60%. And UK is 5%. You may be surprised, but it's 5% fiber to the home. You may ask, why this outcome? Right? All this depends on government policies, the level of government intervention, the incentive, and also the level of private investments and the market competition. Investing in broadband or fiber to the home require a lot of capex over a long period of time. And the returns could only be realized over an even longer period of time. Therefore, there are several ingredients that we need to look at, several factors we need to look at to ensure that the investment will pay it off. I'll talk about a number of these factors. I think first and foremost would be a long-term plan, a digital infrastructure plan, digital strategy. Many countries have this. This is important. Say, for example, in Singapore, we have the Infocom Media Plan 2025. New Zealand, Spain, the UK, they have similar plans. These plans are important because it sets directions and also set expectations, and it will guide various government agencies as well as the private sector players into how to invest and what priorities they should set. So another point I like to make is funding, obviously. This requires a large amount of capex, and therefore it is important that the government will look into how this should be funded. It's not purely by the private sector. We have popular models of PPP. Right? PPP may work in a certain geographic region. And when it comes to PPP, it's also very important to look at risk allocation. There needs to be a proper allocation of risks. There are certain risks that are better managed by the public agencies, and this risk should not be pushed on to the private sector investors. Things like access to certain areas, permits and licenses and all that. These are risks that are best managed by the private sector. Another is the reuse of existing infrastructure. When it comes to fiber to the home rollout, there are a lot of existing infrastructure already in place. Your underground ducts, manholes, and so forth. So, to the furthest extent possible, we should reuse existing infrastructure. This will speed up rollout, reduce the cost of investments, and actually it's also a more sustainable way of investing because it will lower the impact to the environment. Another one is to have a very stable regulatory framework, because having a stable regulatory framework would lower the risk to investors, lower the cost of capital to investors. And ultimately, what it means is that it will also lower the cost for the consumer. Government subsidy, I think Lord Mayor have also talked about government subsidy, is also very important, especially for fiber to the home rollout for the rural areas. Many countries have provided subsidies. Spain have provided subsidies to operators, investors, to roll out fibers to all of the rural areas in Spain. Even Singapore, the government has provided a subsidy of $1 billion so that we could roll out to all the homes in Singapore. So this is important because private sector alone could not fund all of this or could not take on the risk of all of this investment. A final point I'd like to make is this. It would do well government would do well if they create more services that could be used over this digital infrastructure, create demand basically. So the more services that could be used over digital infrastructure like payment services, telehealth, and other kind of transaction that can be done, over the digital infrastructure would also further encourage investors to make investment in the area of digital infrastructure. I think all of these elements are important. It will make for a friendlier environment for private investors to make those investments in the digital infrastructure space. Thank you.
Thanks, Yu Heng. May I invite Chris? Chris, Princeton Digital has been heavily investing into digital infrastructure, particularly data centers. What's your comments and views how to scale up?
Sure. Thanks, Seth. Yeah, so, what I want to talk about today is really around kind of the data centers and the physical infrastructure which the digital economy rests, right? And these are the buildings and, and I'll extend it out to, say, the fiber and some of those hard assets that are difficult to build, difficult to maintain, and as was mentioned, is like, from a capital perspective, some of that, it's a very long horizon and isn't necessarily aligned with what investors want, but it's very important, right? And we've seen that over the past 2 years around the resiliency. We've mentioned that term a lot today, but having the hard infrastructure has really, if you take a look at what we've been through in COVID for the past 2 years and try to imagine doing this 10, 15 years ago with the digital infrastructure that was in place, it would have been a vastly different outcome and different solutions to address it, but much harder problem to solve, I think. But looking at how kind of we can address these issues, right? I want to raise kind of three main topics or three issues. One is that it does take planning on both sides, both from the private and public, and to master plan, right? And to take a look at when you're siting things, I've had the privilege of building digital infrastructure for the past 25 years all around the world. And when you go into it, these are long-term assets, and they take a lot of infrastructure, and they take a lot of resources. And that's changed dramatically in the past probably 5 to 10 years, where data centers before were taking 5, 10 megawatts of power in a particular building. Nowadays, the typical campus, i.e. multiple buildings, is 50 to 100, and there are definitely developments that are being done around the world of, say, 200 to 300 megawatts at a time. And so in order to get the resources at one physical location, you have to plan, you have to coordinate, and that's done with the utility infrastructure, it's done with the electricity, it's done with the water, it's done with the skill sets, right? Data centers are notorious on one side of government view is that they don't employ a lot of people, but they're critical for the digital infrastructure. But the amount of people in there every day, a large, 50 megawatt site can be theoretically ran by 15, 20 people 24 hours a day. That's all it takes with today's technology. And so, but you do need skilled people. And that's the difference, is that you need that pipeline. And so we've done things like, and we've seen this in Singapore, working through agencies like SG Tech and NUS and NTU to develop kind of skilled pipeline of resources to that. We've worked with in different markets around the world on the master planning, working with utility grids to ensure that they have those resources in place and can time it out 5, 10 years ahead, and looking at new ways of incorporating data centers as part of the grid, right? And data centers being that, having 50 to 100 megawatts of, they not only intake that, they also generate it, right? Is that you have these diesel generators or new sources. And that's the other aspect that we need to take a look at from that perspective, is that a lot of the construction and on the operations side of things, the jurisdictions around the world haven't really caught up, especially here in ASEAN, around the technologies. And so lithium ion, right? It needs an exception to be approved, lithium ion batteries. And that just, we need to kind of get those all synced up so that that technical infrastructure can be deployed, same as what is done elsewhere around the world. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Chris. Perhaps we would like a view from the financial side. May I invite Luca from SMBC to give your comments?
Yeah, thank you, Seth, and good morning, everyone. From the capital flow perspective, I think it's Professor Chong said money is limited, but in a sense, from my perspective, I see a lot of it, especially because government like to make it available. But the difficulty is how is it get channeled. What we have seen, even through COVID, as Chris mentioned, is some assets have been extremely resilient, and the digital connectivity and digital assets have been incredibly resilient and attractive. So private sector capital has gone into this asset in a very significant way. I think we have seen probably just the beginning of this trend. Why is capital flowing in this sector? It's certainly because there is a view on demand and the growth. What we heard today, even traditional infrastructure, the way it will be built and monitored, will take a lot of data. And therefore, data becomes in itself almost like a commodity, which requires infrastructure. So we have already seen that even in markets that are typically maybe more difficult to invest in around ASEAN, capital will flow. So what I would say in this connected world, the knots are now in a way quite bankable, because typically the counterparties are big tech, banks, governments, or highly credit-worthy entities. Where it gets challenges is how we create the connectivity among these knots. And that's where, particularly in ASEAN, we need to think how that can happen. The good news is there are good examples in other parts of the infrastructure where capital has been made available because governments, either together or individually, like the case of India, for example, for renewable, when they created a quasi-government entity called SECI, that changed the landscape completely. It's not digital, but what it did, it allowed the private sector to come into the project and take the government payment risk. So in digital connectivity, we can think of a similar approach where maybe a national or an ASEAN-wide credit-worthy entity can be the counterparty for the private sector to invest in fibers and connectivity. The third point, I also make 3 points, it's really all these, and we talk about a lot about sustainability today, and absolutely, sustainability not just from an economic standpoint, but really in CO2 emission terms. And one of the thing we have seen in Europe is regulator monitoring all projects by CO2 emission. And this has started certainly in traditional sector, industrial sector, natural resources, but it will also apply to digital because of the power consumption. So how the data center and the digital infrastructure will be powered, it will be key. It's also key in how traditional infrastructure will be designed. We have seen green loans and green financing applied to even a rail project in Australia, not just to digital. So how do you use hydrogen? How do you use renewable battery storage to create reliable supply? It's a big point. And I think, again, it may not be left to just the data center operator to come up with their own solution. It requires a concerted effort to ensure that there is reliable power supply to the infrastructure.
Thanks, Luca. I think very, very good observations and thought. Let us now move to the third question, which is, logistics in emerging Asia is dominated by small to medium-sized enterprises. What are the solutions available globally that can potentially help meet ASEAN's future priorities for sustainable logistics infrastructure? And for that, may I invite Robert to give your comments and thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, I think logistics and supply chain today, I think, has reached a certain level of prominence, especially with COVID, and everybody realized that importance of connectivity, and your supply chain must flow. I think looking at that, Asia is dominated, like what you said, with small, medium enterprises in that sector. At the same time, I think we are looking at not really very connected infrastructure, which provide a challenge, but at the same time an opportunity. Right? So in ASEAN, I think last year, I think we launched what we call the ASEAN Smart Logistics Network. All right, so the ASLN, and that was done in Vietnam, Hanoi. where we launched a project which I personally actually joint venture together with the TNT Corporation of Hanoi, Vietnam, to incorporate what we call the Vietnam Superport. Right. So like what Lord Meyer has said, don't forget your old infrastructure. Old infrastructure doesn't have to be forgotten because not all old infrastructures are actually operating at its max potential. Right. So max potential before you think of going another level. Right. So that's a mistake a lot of us do because we all just follow trend. Right? It's nice, sexy to do this, and we just put our money there. So the superport concept is literally that, to look at how we enhance the port. Right? So the port has not reached its full potential. So how do we extend that? So in many countries, not just Vietnam, I think many other countries, you have ports that have served its usefulness or has reached a certain capacity that it couldn't expand. So what do? Build another port? Not necessary. All right? So the superport is an extension of that. How do we extend port into the country, the city itself, and then use that to fulfill manufacturing, supply chain, or logistics and fulfillment, for even e-commerce and so on. So I think this is the kind of thing, and use the opportunity to build a smart infrastructure, right? I like the other takeaway, I think we have something in common about digital twin, right? So I think it's fantastic, right? So we do digital twinning so that we can look at monitoring it and the whole of life cycle in terms of our infrastructure. When we build infrastructure, it's meant to build for a long, long time. It's a legacy, right? We put it there, it's supposed to last for life. So we want to monitor it to see how we can expand and improve as we go with new technologies and so on. I think this is very well said. And this, I thought that in the way that we look at how we help the companies, right, in terms of the sector itself, I myself grown from a small to medium to we are considered a large enterprise today in the logistics sector. And if you look at from that journey itself, what is required is management, your process management, right? If you cannot manage process well, you can't run a logistics company, all right? So that's very important. Luckily, there are a lot of technology there, warehousing management system, traffic management system, transport management system, and so on to help, right, the operator do. I think those are things that I think you can easily get. But then the other part is talking about finance. Finance, I think logistics always have a problem trying to get good finance because it's not a sexy industry. Margins are not that great. Banks are not so, I think, not so attracted to that industry because, so this is one of the things. Of course, it's changing now. It's changing now because you realize that that's logistics is a very important element, right, for any country's growth and so on. So this is a good time. But the key part is really manpower, talent. You can grow your business, invest in technology, build infrastructure, but where is the talent? So talent become a very key important. So in our Superport project, we actually not just building a smart physical infrastructure, we are building an entire ecosystem around it. All right, the ecosystem of creating innovation through productivity and so on, through actually building an ecosystem for startup. So we're looking at Singapore startups in Vietnam and anywhere else. They are looking at a new solution, new innovation for the supply chain logistics industry. So that's an area that we are also building. And of course, the academy for us to be able to upskill, reskill, right? The population. So when we actually do, invest in the Superport in Vietnam, for example, we are raising the bar for the supply chain capabilities, all right, of the people. So that the companies, whether it's small, medium enterprise, can all ride on that because it's an industry training thing, to ride on that to grow together in the whole value chain. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. We have Arun on the line. Shall we, Arun, would you like to make a few comments or observations on the logistics space?
Sure. I think the biggest problem facing the logistic industry is the digitization, which is lacking, and also the planning of and forecasting of the supply chain, which eventually goes to the manufacturers and the shortage of products which are available. So I agree with what Mr. Robert had said and others have said, that it is not throwing up the existing infrastructure, but just trying to improve it with the technologies available and the manpower which needs which should be highly skilled. Thank you.
Thanks, Arun. I think we are a little bit short of time, so I'll try to wrap up this brainstorming session. I think today we have learned a lot from our esteemed Asia panel members and also the industry leaders and experts. They have certainly given us a lot of food for thought in terms of the ASEAN priorities. How do we look at them? How do we tackle them, particularly in the area of digital infrastructure, where more could be done by perhaps bringing public to work with the private sector. And in the case of logistics and supply chain, how to scale up this sector where it is traditionally dominated by small to medium-sized enterprises. I think certainly, hopefully, this sharing has been useful to everyone. Now we'd like to move to the last segment of today's sharing, which is an initiative that Arun from the CEO of Leonie Hill Capital and Infrastructure Asia are working on together with Cambodia government. And to set the stage, may I invite His Excellency Hem Van Ly from the Secretary of State, the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Cambodia, to give his remarks on why this cold chain initiative is important for Cambodia. Your Excellency, please.
Excellency Indranee Rajah, Minister in the Prime Minister Office and Second Minister for Finance and National Development of Singapore. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to join you at this Asia Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory Panel. The Asia Panel provides a strong platform to promote sustainable infrastructure development in the Asian region, and it is indeed an opportune time to discuss the scaling up of cold chain logistic infrastructure in Cambodia with you today. The government of the Kingdom of Cambodia placed high importance on investment in cold chain logistic infrastructure and consider it a strategic priority to enhance competitiveness and shelf life of our agricultural and food products. Cold chain is a necessity for not only agricultural products, but also for horticulture, floriculture, dairy, confectionery, pharmaceutical, industrial chemical, poultry, and meat processing. Rapid urbanization and growing populations and economic growth have led to an increased need for fresh, quality, and timely food supplies and delivery. As agriculture remains significant to Cambodia's economy and the livelihoods of the majority of our people, an efficient, cost-effective, sustainable, and integrated cold chain logistic infrastructure will be a game changer for our farmers, particularly those working in horticulture. Productivity gain and value addition are expected to boost rural household income and revitalize agriculture as Cambodia and the world face insurmountable agrarian challenges exacerbated by climate change. Cambodia's cold chain industry is still at its early stage of development, but demand is growing strongly. Investment is happening, but we need to strengthen capacity building, technical support, financing, and cost supply chain management to meet industry requirements and global standards. Our goal is to advance the country's economic competitiveness and inclusiveness by expanding market access for Cambodia agricultural products, improving infrastructure and logistics, enhancing agricultural services, and promoting private sector engagement and investment across the value chains. The exponential growth in e-commerce and food tech industry in Cambodia provides a huge demand for cold chain infrastructure. I am sure the same is true for countries in our region, whose shares of agriculture remain significant to the economy and the well-being of the society. With the recent promulgation of our new investment law, Cambodia does offer attractive FDI potential for cold storage players operating in the ASEAN and the regional markets. Public-private partnership also play an important role in the implementations of cold chain infrastructure. Our ministry, MEF, is keen to work with all stakeholders from both public and private sector to implement projects that improve and value add the quality and hygiene of our agriculture produce, meat, fishery, and seafood products. We invite private companies from the region to come and partner with Cambodia to build a strong cold chain infrastructure and enhance the competitiveness of our country products in the region. We thank the government of Singapore and Infrastructure Asia for the generous support and cooperation for the development of such project. And we will hear more on the proposal from LHCs. Finally, I wish Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, a good health, happiness, and success. And I wish everyone, including LHC, success in the development of such project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. In the next segment, Arun and myself, we will share briefly about this coaching initiative, which hopefully will offer some lessons for how to scale up further coaching projects, not just in Cambodia, perhaps around the region. I'll start off first by setting the stage why we decided to focus on this subsector as a project, and also to give some highlights why Cambodia. And now I'll pass on to Arun to talk a little bit about what his company or what his fund, his Singapore registered fund, is trying to do in this initiative. To set the stage, coaching, as everyone knows, is not a singular project like a power project or a water project. It is a chain. Hence, it is important to keep the temperature under a certain band in order for the produce or the meat to be properly stored during the phase of delivery from farm to fork. For exporting country, the first two segments on the left, from the farm, the delivery from the farm to the cold chain warehouse is a very, very important segment. And oftentimes you don't have the technology to preserve the temperature of the produce. And of course, when you have the produce at the storage, it is important to properly store it before it is ready for exports. And this is the two segments that this initiative is going to focus on. Next slide, please. When we started on this journey in the early stage of the pandemic, we had started to interview as Infrastructure Asia a lot of C-suites in these industries, and we spoke to some of the biggest importers of meat and other produce into China, and we understood that actually there's a real need for food produce coming from ASEAN into the bigger economies like China and Japan. This includes fruits, fish, meats, and vegetables. They are already selling, but more could be needed. And in light of COVID, there's actually a greater and heightened awareness of food security around every country. Hence, this may provide an opportunity for newer exporting countries because there's a greater need for food diversity and food security amongst the importing countries. Of course, food industry, health and safety is always important, but in the case of Cambodia, why we were particularly interested in Cambodia is because the vaccination rate in the population is very high compared to some of the other ASEAN countries. So as a starting point for this initiative, this provides a good platform. Next slide, please. One of the three words came out from our discussions with the C-suites that is very, very important to focus on when we want to look at cold chain. And the three words are scale, scale, and scale. So with the right scale, you can actually aggregate the cold chain facilities to attract international, credible financiers and investors to invest into that project, like what China did in the last 10 years with their ambient warehouses. A lot of funds are investing into it. Scale is important to attract quality developers and implement modern designs in cold chain that are future-proof. And scale is very important to generate economies of scale. Singular, small farmers can only do so much. Singular, small warehouses can only do so much. If you need to export, if the interest is to export at volume to credible and off-takers in bigger countries, scale is important. Now I'd like to pass on to Arun to talk about what he's trying to do in Cambodia. Arun, please. Next slide.
Thank you. Now, the key elements of building a logistic infrastructure is to help the small and medium farmers to basically take their produce and should be able to use it for the domestic and the exports market. Now, we all know that more than 40% of produce now goes waste because of the facilities like cold chain is not available to small and medium scale farmers. And what we are trying to do is to focus on certain food types, okay, and look at the demand, which is both used for domestic and the export market. And by using an hub and spoke model, aggregate this demand, okay, and maintain the quality and the standards and get them to export, thereby making sure that the farmers and the small and medium scale enterprise get the benefits of not only the domestic market, but also for the export market. Now, very key to this is to design a facility which basically takes care of what is currently available in Cambodia and improve on those design, and so that in future that could be easily maintained. So now we are looking at solar and the grids for this project, and we will make sure that going forward, this is also become scalable and also environmentally friendly. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at what technology we have proven in a few countries, is all our technology we are suggesting today for Cambodia works on solar and as well as the power grid. Now, it reduces the carbon emissions for the transportation, and also what happens is we have software technologies to be put on the transport systems, which will take care of the idling and the dead mileage problems currently associated with such supply chains. Now, if you look at, which we call it the green delivery. Now, also our technology is such that that the manufacturers of different sizes can be done to suit the farm needs in either in aqua or in agriculture based on products. And this can sustain refrigeration for 6 hours because it is also tagged to a solar panel attached to these containers. Now, most key in the developing nations is maintenance of these products and manufacturing of these products locally, so that again, it could be sustainable for long term by creating small manufacturing centers, also manufacturing, also developing small warehouses closer to the consumers so that the products can be delivered. What we call it as an Amazon effect as the e-commerce takes over. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Next slide, please. I'll conclude by sharing the next steps that this initiative is doing. There are two-pronged approach that the Leonie Hill Capital is taking together with Infrastructure Asia. On the feasibility side, the idea is to pick a small handful, less than half a dozen of commodity produce, agri-produce, that we will work together with a development finance institution to hopefully fund the bulk of the feasibility study. Leonie Hill is prepared to fund the remainder. And the idea is that this feasibility study will work through the details of what needs to be done or tweaked in order to make each of these commodity exports successful. And the hope is to finish the feasibility study working in collaboration with the Royal Government of Cambodia by the end of 2022. In parallel, and this is very important because nothing beats a pilot to really understand the issues of implementation. Of course, the pilot cannot be too small, otherwise it is not attractive to the bigger importing countries like China and Japan. So Leonie Hill is prepared to invest about 100 to 150 million US into the pilot. But it's also not too big so that it can be scaled up to other produce in the country later on. And the idea is to choose one or maybe two agri-produce to scale up using this pilot, to learn lessons from it and then apply the lessons back into the broader feasibility study. And we hope to commence this pilot as early as the beginning of 2022 and then complete the pilot during that year. Of course, a local partner will be very, very important to ensure the success of this project. So hopefully today's sharing allows everyone a view of what some of these bigger teams could translate into singular projects, and in this case, a pilot, as we look to help ASEAN focus on addressing its priorities. I think we have almost run out of time. In fact, we have exceeded time. So I would like now to spend a couple of minutes to wrap up. Thank you, distinguished guests, our co-organizers, ASEAN Secretariat, ASEAN LIPSI and the discussions of this very enlightening session. The LIPSI survey findings have shown that even as ASEAN shifts towards a post-pandemic recovery, sustainable infrastructure forms a complementary and necessary component of the recovery process and is a priority for the future. To accelerate the transition to sustainability alongside tackling the complex issues of climate change, urban resilience, and social inclusion, more public and private collaboration is needed to fuel innovations and to show up deficiencies in various parts of the infrastructure space. We hope that today's discussions on the future of infrastructure has proven to be fruitful and thought-provoking for those seeking opportunities for sustainable infrastructure in the region. Please do reach out to LIPSI, to the ASEAN Secretariat, and to the speakers today. If you don't have their contacts, let us know and we will connect them with you. And if you have any needs in terms of digital or logistics or other types of infrastructure that is needed in the current times, do reach out to Infrastructure Asia. We are happy to connect you to the right parties in our ecosystem. Thank you very much for attending and listening to us today. We hope it has been helpful, and I thank everyone for your time this morning. Thank you.